Welcome to Friday night's video and our Master Series. This is the 14th video in our Master Series and the first video in our editing phase. I wanted to address a couple issues before we actually get started in doing some editing. And the first issue is software. Your DAW, you're going to really have to look in your DAW, and as we go through this phase, see how well your DAW does the things we're talking about and how good of a job it does. And it should take care of most of the issues that you run into very well. It might be a little bit more time consuming in just your actual DAW. The other thing is RX. Once you have the basics in your studio and you've purchased the basic things, I recommend this piece of software being your next purchase or something equivalent to it. It's a beautiful piece of software that you can do a lot of editing of audio on. You can fix a lot of things with this. You can actually manipulate samples with this piece of software. You can use your actual plugins in this piece of software to process and as you're editing or while you're processing, and you can visualize the audio fairly well in this piece of software. So it's something I highly recommend. The next thing that I would recommend is something like, if you're going to be an audio engineer and you're really into audio engineering, is MATLAB. I learned audio engineering in MATLAB, and this piece of software can visualize audio very well. And not only that, is besides visualizing it in a lot of different ways, you can also manipulate the audio in this piece of software. This piece of software, you can manipulate the audio in ways, even all the way down to the binary information itself. You can see the actual binary information of your right and left and the actual samples themselves and manipulate them manually. And you can do all kinds of other types of editing with this piece of software. So I do recommend you check it out. It would be worth checking out. REW, this piece of software, once you understand what it's displaying to you and what you can do with it, it's a great piece of software looking at audio and seeing what's going on. And also, besides that, Sonic Visualizer. It's a free piece of software you can download. It's great for visualizing audio. It won't let you do any editing, but you can actually really get some really fine detail about what's going on with audio with this piece of software. It's a great piece of software for visualizing audio. So those things I do recommend. The next thing I wanted to address is the actual editing process. This is a huge phase because normally for me the editing process comes to cleaning it up. So to clean up the audio as well as possible, to check for any problems in the audio, clicks, plops, bleeps, whatever, and doing flow editing. Those are the primary things that I mess with when I'm doing audio. And they're hugely important because if you don't do a good job of these, that later on, no matter how good a job you do later on, that it won't mean much because you don't have good pristine stuff to work with. The first example is you've got just a little bit of noise that you didn't go ahead and high-low pass filter, even just simple little high-low pass filtering of your audio, that it may just be a little bit of salt in the soup, but when you add 40 tracks together to make your soup and all that little pinches of salt add up, you got a whole tablespoon of soup that it's going to get heard. And that's one example. And another example, if you don't do the flow editing well and you don't take care of the dynamic issues well and the lengths of notes and things like that, or vocals, that it can cause problems. It will never sound right and they will pick up on it, and no matter how good of a job you do later, that it's just not, it's never going to be that perfect piece of work that you're trying to work on. So, and I try to make that very clear during the recording process, and I'm the same with this phase and every other phase, explaining to you that the importance of dealing with that. Now, one thing you will come to understand is between this phase and the next phase, first phase processing, sometimes you might throw things back and forth. You know, some things you might add to your editing phase and you go, well, no, I'm kind of doing that in my first phase processing. You'll get a workflow. If you deal with the meat and potato things I'm talking about in this editing phase, so that you have an editing phase that I'm dealing with cleaning things up, clicks, plops, bleeps, things like that, making sure that I do my flow editing well, and then checking things for later on. I hear this piece of audio and I go, well, I don't know if I want to fuss with that right now because that might sound cool later in the mix. You know, when I do some editing, when I do some first phase processing and I start mixing it in with that bass and that drum, is that going to sound cool? Fire, bam, wham. You know, I mean, is that going to sound cool there? Do I want to fuss with that right now and edit it? Do I want to edit that, or do I want to make a note about it and fuss with it maybe later? Because sometimes your editing phase can cross into all phases. I mean, you can be editing when you're recording by punching things in. You can be editing in your first phase processing and your mixing. You know, as you hear things, how's that panning out? Or is that not sounding like I thought? And I need to fix that. So you have to keep that in mind and make notes when you hear issues or you got questions. That means you heard an issue. That means it's important. That means make a note about it. So making notes about things really well. And, you know, understand that I always tell you to do a good job as possible on each piece of audio you're working on. But you will find sometimes that you've got an oboe way in the background or something that just wash. That, you know, it's just like background for something going on out in front. And you may not want to fuss with it as much, you know, but, you know, just keep in mind the things I talked about because it might not be that big a deal and it might be great for the mix and you might be wasting a whole lot of time on something that you don't need to. Just remember, if you get those things done, the meat and potatoes things I talked about, and that's done well on all your tracks, that anything else you might be fussing with, you got to kind of take that into consideration. That what is this piece of audio's job? Where is it going? And what type of a production or what's happening with this piece of audio? Is that going to be real important? Do I need to deal with that? And to keep that into consideration. So we will be going through a workflow, and keep in mind that when we go through the workflow in this editing phase, that it's a place for you to start so you can start getting your own workflow so that you have an editing phase, so that you, when you get done recording, that you have an actual editing phase that's, you've got a good workflow and a process to go through so that you do a good job every time. You know, if you've got the recording, it's like a car, and, you know, everything was done well there. And then it goes to the editing, you know, and they're doing prep on it, you know, before it goes into processing, you know, that they start, you know, processing it or whatever so that it comes out looking like this beautiful, you know, 1957 Chevy with this beautiful paint job. You know, that every phase is hugely important to do a good job. And for the reasons that you already understand. Things will build up. If you don't clean things up, you get a buildup of that stuff from tracks. And if you don't take care of things, they'll hear it. It's like you can do a great job in your processing and your mixing later, but if you didn't do a good job in your recording and your editing phase, and they catch it, and they're like, dude, the whole recording, it's great, and then all of a sudden, wank, you know, what is that? You know, what is that going on there? You know, well, why didn't he fix that? You know, because you didn't do a good job in your editing phase. If it was a problem with your recording phase, you should have caught it in your editing phase and taken the time to fix it. You know, things even can be something very simple as just stretching a little piece of audio, just, you know, a minute amount so that it's bam where it's supposed to be. Or it's like, it's okay, it's kind of free, and it's like, it doesn't need to be that bam. It doesn't need to be that, because it's kind of flowing and it's okay. It sounds good like that. And you have to be able to make those determinations and to make sure that it's part of your mentality to be able to make good judgment calls on that, and that will come in time. But it's a better idea that if something doesn't sound right and it's something you need to deal with in the meat and potatoes that we're talking about going through this editing phase, then it's probably something you should deal with. Now later on you might change that. I mean, you might go through and do quantization on the track and humanize it a little bit or something, you know, because it's, you know, you just, you know, robustized it way too much. You know what I'm saying? And that has happened a couple times. You know, you run into that when you're fussing with MIDI sometimes, that it's just way too robotic and you're trying to liven it up a little bit somehow, you know, and it can be the same thing when you're editing, so you got to be kind of careful of that. You know, I've found that most of the time that it's pretty obvious if you need to fix something. And if you can't make a judgment call on it and know who you're working with, to where, I know I need to edit this, or no, I know Bob, he's like you're trying to pour jello into a mold. He's going to flow all over the place, and he's not into that, and it's going to sound robotic to him, and he ain't going to go for that. And you have to be able to make those judgment calls of your own personal taste or who you're working for, and that will come with time. So get out some notebooks and get ready. We will get into the editing phase, the actual workflow, in the next video, and we'll get out some audio and start trying to do some editing on it so you can visualize and see a workflow and visualize some things happening, so you can understand the importance of it a little better, the things that we're talking about and what those things are that I'm speaking of. So peace, hope, love. I certainly hope you enjoyed this first video in our editing phase, and I'll see you in the next video when we get into the workflow and start visualizing some actual editing.